Hello, I'm David Bachman, and I'm the Henry M. Jackson Professor of International Studies in the Jackson School. And I'm here to talk today about the United States and China. I originally told Professor Casaba I'd use the title of the United States and China Rivalry, Competition, Cold War. Since that time, of course, we've had the coronavirus outbreak, and I'll start with there. But before I do, I hope you're all safe and healthy, and I hope it continues to be that way. So I asked you to read an essay by Evan Osnos that appeared in the January 8th issue, I believe, of the New Yorker this year. And I'll pick up with where he left off, that the United States and China, I thought he did an excellent job of showing some of the complexities there, challenging some of the conventional wisdom that the United States might approach China with, some of the problems that China's own views of the U.S. might have. And I'm going to use that as a theme for part of today's lecture, which will come in a number of different parts. So let me just pick up with the United States and China in 2020, what happened in January, February, March, and April, and then try and make some sense of that. So the novel coronavirus causing the disease COVID-19 has been circulating in China for weeks in January. Chinese officials denied the existence of serious disease for much of the first half of January, and in the end of December into January, they punished some doctors trying to warn of it and tried to keep the lid on as China was preparing for Chinese New Year's, a big national holiday, and a big boon for the national economy. While this was going on, the United States and China had been engaged in a trade war. That trade war had cost both sides substantially in important ways, affecting U.S. agriculture in particular, affecting Chinese exports to the United States. Both sides were weary. I'm not sure that the Chinese were quite as confident they could manage it as Osnos says. But on January 15th, the U.S. and China signed a Phase 1 trade agreement, which called a temporary truce to the ongoing trade war, with the expectation, perhaps an unrealistic one, that there would be a second agreement that would address much more fundamental types of issues that the U.S. has with the Chinese economy, which I'll touch on later today. On January 23rd, China admitted to the coronavirus, the COVID-19. It locked down the major city of Wuhan in central China, which has a population of about 11 million, and then much of Hubei province. Wuhan is the capital of Hubei, and with a population approaching 60 million. But we should remember that there had already been a case in Washington state by that time. And as the epidemic deepens, China, the world's largest producer of N95 masks and other personal protective equipment, buys much more from the world market, it should be, and receives international aid and donations from many NGOs, depleting their stockpile of emergency equipment. While this is going on, President Trump downplays the risk to the United States, saying that China is doing a good job with the virus. It's not going to be a big deal here if it comes at all, and it'll go away. Nothing to worry about. But by the end of the month, Trump sort of bars travel from China to the U.S. and evacuates U.S. citizens from Wuhan, including the staff of the U.S. Consulate General's office there. Some Chinese were barred from coming to the U.S. at that time, but many others were able to come in, and large numbers did fly out of China, coming to the United States in January and February and so on. Moving on to February. Clearly, U.S.-China tensions were high, even with the coronavirus, even with the Phase 1 trade deal. The U.S. identified 5 Chinese media organizations in the U.S. as state agencies. This required them to register and for their employees to report their movements to the State Department. About the same time that was happening, the Wall Street Journal published an op-ed entitled China, the Real Sick Man of Asia. The actual op-ed was more about China's financial system, but an op-ed editorial writer put this title on in light of the coronavirus outbreak. And as a result, this resonated with views early in the 20th century of China as the sick man of Asia, which many Chinese see as derogatory, inflammatory, making fun of China. And as a result, China expelled 3 Wall Street Journal reporters. Meanwhile, China is trying to shut down all of its economy, all of its travel to try to control COVID-19. And more ominously for the United States, unbeknownst to almost anyone, COVID-19 was already spreading in U.S. communities and around the world. By the end of February, the outbreak in the U.S. was clear as a Kirkland, Washington life care facility had many cases and the first U.S. fatalities. And for a brief time in late February, early March, King County was the epicenter of the outbreak in the U.S., moving on to New York more recently. But nonetheless, this was the center of where the virus was going. Some of you will probably remember that on March 5th, President Kaosi canceled in-class instructions beginning March 9th. And so we're like this, and we've been like this since March 9th. In March, the U.S. limited the 5 Chinese media organizations in the U.S. to 100 personnel. They had about 160. And China immediately responded by expelling all U.S. citizens' correspondents of the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Post, and telling their Chinese-based staffs and Chinese citizens not to work for the Western press. In March, the coronavirus began to diminish in China and recovery starts slowly, but the coronavirus, as I trust we all know, took off in the U.S. in March. And after denying the seriousness of COVID-19, the administration begins to pay attention, but the U.S. had done nothing to prepare for an outbreak, and so our response has been, to put it mildly, less than excellent, to put it, and in fact has been almost a disaster. Trump and other officials talk of the Wuhan or China virus in an effort to scapegoat China for the faults of the administration. This angers the Chinese. Others in the U.S. speculate that COVID was or is a bioweapon that escaped the lab. There are a couple of related labs in Wuhan where the outbreak began. Whether this was something that was being engineered or whether it was a natural virus being studied in the Institute of Virology, also in Wuhan, and where perhaps biocontainment failed and the virus made it out to the public. In response to the U.S. speculation about the Chinese origins of the disease, and I will say that I'm convinced that the disease, or certainly the epidemic, broke out in Wuhan and spread from there to the rest of the world. Whether it originated in some original sense is less clear to me, but nonetheless, it seems likely that Wuhan was the true epicenter of the disease. A Chinese official responding to the U.S. suggests that the virus was imported into Wuhan during the World Military Games held in Wuhan in October 2019 by U.S. soldiers participating in those games. Towards the end of the month, Trump and Xi Jinping have a phone conversation. They lower the rhetoric. China provides aid to the U.S. and also to Europe and other countries as it has mobilized its own factories to build and construct more and more masks, shields, protective garments, and so on and so forth. Moving on to April. A more critical tone towards China appears within administration officials or among administration officials. Secretary Pompeo tries to get the UN to pass a resolution blaming China for the coronavirus and the lack of full disclosure. with China being a powerful voice in the UN with a Security Council veto. This, of course, is a non-starter. Pompeo is essentially wasting his time, but nonetheless, the U.S. feels it's important to try to score propaganda points rather than come up with a global response to the coronavirus. Hawks in the administration push for decoupling or the separation of the U.S. and the Chinese economy of the economic relationship, and they've been pushing this from February to the present, arguing that the U.S. should deny technology to Chinese firms. Trump allows them to continue in February, but clearly this is on the agenda and would be a major blow for Chinese firms. U.S. continues to try to force its allies to not use Huawei, which is China's leading technology company, to use Huawei technology, backbone infrastructure, networks, and so on for 5G phone communications. So far, reflecting the sort of lack of support that the U.S. has among its allies, only 3 of 61 formal allies have agreed not to use Huawei. Attitudes towards China in Washington, D.C. by both parties are hardening, Republicans more than the U.S., the Republicans seeming to want to cut off ties immediately, the Democrats understanding perhaps the degree of interdependence, are happy to or are willing to work with China in the short run, but are critical of human rights and many other issues, suggesting that there is an element of bipartisan consensus that's deeply critical of China, wants the relationship to change. Some, in op-eds and backed by others, by Republican senators and so on, suggest that China should be sued for damages caused by COVID. Where this would take place, under what jurisdictions, ignoring the fact that China in many cases has sovereign immunity, how you would collect, what criminal statutes apply. That's not part of their argument. Again, it's more about point scoring. Meanwhile, the virus has basically subsided substantially in the PRC. China's trying to get its economy restarted. It reaffirms its commitment to the January 15th trade deal. It will honor the deal, so it says. In point of fact, that's going to be extraordinarily difficult for a variety of reasons I won't go into. China provides global aid. It emphasizes its successful epidemic management, at least after it shut down Wuhan. It doesn't, needless to say, emphasize the 6 or so weeks before the shutdown when the virus was allowed to spread largely unchecked and unmentioned, and that allowed it to spread to the world. This Chinese example of successful containment of the virus is contrasted with U.S. failures, and the propaganda fight continues. Towards the present day, the Trump administration, or there's a group putting out a pro-Trump campaign ad that features Biden as soft on China, apparently using former governor of Washington State, Gary Locke, to represent Chinese leaders. He was the U.S. ambassador at the time. And so it goes that the United States and China are worse off today than they were back in January 15th when we signed the trade deal, which was a lot worse than where we were, say. Okay, picking up with what needs to happen. Americans, and especially American politicians, have to look at China not through the glasses of American capitalist democracy or similar perspectives, such as China as human rights abuser, China as market, and so on. They need to see, or at least understand, how Chinese see China, its strengths and weaknesses, its hopes and fears. The Chinese people may not see their future as an American-style democracy. And if they do, it's one where they will have to make that future and so on. Moreover, the U.S. needs to learn this fundamental lesson of the last 20 or more years, and that is the U.S. tried to impose its power and its systems of governance and economy on the Afghans, the Iraqis, to a lesser extent the Libyans. It may still try to do so for North Koreans and Iranians. The record of Americans, of acting on American-centered or American-centric views, values, institutions in other parts of the world is not pretty. It's been a failure stretching back to Vietnam and the ones that I've mentioned, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and so on. More importantly, it wasn't successful in many, many respects. Treating China as fitting into this pattern is a ticket to disaster. It's simply not something the U.S. has the power to do. It's not something that will lead to a secure democracy in China, I would argue. That the chances that a post-communist China looks at best like Hungary today or Poland, and at worst looks like Russia or even more confrontational, is just as great, if not greater, in my view. For China, China's leaders need to realize again, and they did recognize this from the mid-90s to the late 2000s, that China as a very large and increasingly powerful state is seen as threatening to many, if only because of its size. But if it acts assertively, that only generates more and more resentment. There may not be things that small countries can do or smaller countries can do about their resentment towards China, but they're looking for ways to get out of being so subservient to China, to being quite as sort of dominated by China, looking for the United States, perhaps under a different administration, to ally with them and work with them in ways that gives them greater freedom of action, et cetera, et cetera. China's leaders need to realize that at least up to the present, the U.S. has been a much greater contributor to China's rise than it has been a hindrance. That the fact that China, even with the tariffs, was able to sell as much as it did to the United States speaks to a United States that has not tried to contain China much before this time, and certainly from 1970s up through at least the start of the Trump administration, was actively contributing to China's own development and saw this in ways that were making the United States and China more rather than less compatible. That may have been, from an American perspective, leading to greater introductions of societal differentiation, pluralism, and so on in ways that might challenge Communist Party rule. But for the most part, the United States was, and to a degree still is, a partner in China's own advance. China's leaders also need to remember that the 20 years when the U.S. and China were hostile to each other in the past, 1950 to 1970, was not a good time for China. Now, much of that had a lot to do with what Mao Zedong was doing inside China. The U.S. was hardly the only reason for that bad time in China, but Sino-American confrontation contributed to it. And other things equal, Chinese and American leaders should try to avoid further confrontations. So this leads us to a period, again, going back to Osnos, of uneasy coexistence. The consequences of armed conflict between the two sides would be disastrous for the U.S., China, and the world. The U.S. and China have some fundamentally incompatible interests. It is not simply a question of U.S.-China misunderstanding or lack of understanding. There are some areas where we have fundamental incompatible interests. Human rights as understood in both societies being one, Taiwan perhaps being another area, security in Asia being yet another. So it's not simply that we're, through more communication or more learning, we can do better, although that wouldn't hurt. There has to be a fundamental recognition that our interests clash, and then we have to figure out a way to managing those clashes of interest in ways that prevent further escalation of clashes or spillover effects into other areas. each somehow is going to have to learn to put up with the other, that we simply have to accept the other isn't going to disappear. We're going to have to figure out as we go along new ways of dealing with each other as each has its own particular strengths and weaknesses. Those will change and evolve over time so that our strategies, our ways that we learn to deal with each other also have to change over time. That will not be easy, and it will be a hard sell in either country's domestic politics, and perhaps for the egos of the two current leaders. And that leaves me with my final thought here, which I'm happy to discuss with you when we have our live session. Unfortunately, right now, uneasy coexistence is probably the best we can hope for. And with that, I look forward to our discussion coming up in a few days. And again, please stay healthy, stay safe, and I hope to talk to you on Tuesday. Bye. 3 or 4 years ago. And I'm going to stop this segment of this presentation and pick up with what comes next in a minute. Picking up with what comes next in the short run. So the U.S. economy has been devastated by COVID. It's not likely to recover quickly. A deep, prolonged recession is likely. A deep, prolonged recession is likely, and the same is true with Europe. So, the administration does face a very difficult task here. If the U.S. relaxes anti-COVID measures too soon, infections will return in large numbers. There may be a second or third wave of COVID cases. This would be true everywhere. It's not clear how much immunity that having the COVID virus would necessarily give to you. So even if you've had it once, will that last for 3 months, 6 months, 12 months? Who knows? We don't know. It's too new a disease to have these answers. Basically, we're likely to go through waves of COVID outbreaks that will only conclusively end with successful COVID vaccines widely administered so that herd immunity results from that. And even then, we don't know whether you'll need one shot that lasts you for your life or have to get recurring numbers of shots, et cetera, et cetera. The U.S., European, Japanese economic recessions will hurt the Chinese economy as a significant portion of its economy is geared to exports to developed country markets. It's already clear that many global supply chains are greatly disrupted. They are not easily redirected. And so we're facing a prolonged global recession, perhaps worse than the 2007 to 2012 recession that resulted from the global financial crisis. And of course, we're deep into the U.S. electoral political season. I think the presidential election will be a referendum on President Trump. And to deflect blame for the problems caused by the administration's failure to act on COVID in a timely and complete way, Trump will scapegoat China and the WHO, the World Health Organization, with the unfortunate, inevitable result that Asians in the U.S. and Asian Americans will be the victims of sort of anti-Asian, anti-Chinese feeling that these campaign and political rhetoric, campaign ads and political rhetoric will inflict on the country. So let's go back then and quickly rehash what had been going on with China during the Trump administration. For most of 2017, this was a period of quiet before the storm, that there'd been a couple of meetings between Xi Jinping, China's leader, and President Trump, one at Mar-a-Lago at his estate in Florida, and another with a state visit by Trump to the PRC. But in December 2017, the U.S. issued a national security strategy that identified China as a military, political, and economic competitor, trying to replace the current international system and as a revisionist power, which in the language of international relations is saying that someone really wants to upend the international system. It's a challenge to you as the defender, supposedly, of the international system, and that you're in a close to zero-sum type of conflict. So on the security dimension, the United States has already identified China as a very serious challenger, as a major problem in international relations and for American foreign policy by the end of 2017. Shortly thereafter, in early 2018, the United States began to institute tariffs against China and others for a variety of reasons on a variety of products. The emphasis on China was the greatest, covering more and more types of Chinese exports to the United States. And by late 2019, more than half of all Chinese imports into the U.S. were subject to extra tariffs. China imposed its own tariffs on U.S. products, and where it could, it chose to stop buying a number of them. The U.S. objected not just to China's trade practices, but it objected to government involvement in the Chinese economy, Chinese government subsidies and supports for China's industrial advancement, the Chinese program known as Made in China 2025, which was supposed to propel Chinese technology firms to the front rank of world producers. And as well, the United States objected to particular technology transfers to Huawei and ZTE, another Chinese telecoms information communications technology firm, for evading sanctions on North Korea and Iran. The U.S. sees China stealing vast amounts of U.S. technology, channeling it back into Chinese firms, closing the technology gap, and otherwise unfairly entering into competition with U.S. firms. Throughout 2018-2019, the U.S. conducts freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea with U.S. naval ships and military aircraft, where they often come close to confrontations with Chinese ships and military aircraft. In one case, a U.S. destroyer and a Chinese frigate came within 50 yards of each other, extraordinarily close for ships moving rapidly at sea. Imagine if there'd been a collision or other accident and how this might have played out given the increasingly tense relationship between the two sides. There are supposed to be rules that both sides follow when it comes to encounters at sea and in the air, but both sides seem to be not honoring these, and so the possibility of an accident leading to heightened tensions and conflict is not all that far away. Meanwhile, as well, FBI Director Wray, the Department of Justice, see extensive Chinese spying by non-traditional means and collectors, whether it's by cyber espionage, whether it's by Chinese Americans, Chinese students, Chinese graduate students in the United States, Chinese visitors to the United States. In other words, they create a specter of potentially any Chinese person in the United States or people in the United States with connections to China being sources of intelligence, of information for China. And so the Department of Justice, the FBI, calls for a whole of government and a whole of society approach to stop it. And this, again, in the University of Washington context, has meant a great tightening up about collaborations with institutions in China, about whether, in fact, the UW will accept research money from Huawei, and so on and so forth. By the end of the year, the U.S. has indicted Huawei and its chief financial officer, a woman named Meng Wanzhou, for violating U.S. sanctions and other criminal acts. She's arrested on her way through Canada, traveling on to Europe, and she awaits extradition there. Meng is the daughter of the founder of Huawei, and this is clearly a signal that the administration is very critical of Huawei and wants to sort of eliminate Huawei as a competitor in the 5G field to prevent it from becoming a dominant source of 5G technology and other cutting-edge technologies. The U.S. has tightened up on Chinese investment in the U.S. It's now very difficult for Chinese to buy into U.S. companies, although they still are able to buy U.S. real estate. As well, China's treatment of Uyghurs, the largest ethnic group in Xinjiang, Muslims and other Muslims in Xinjiang, are put in what the Chinese call retraining camps, what others outside of China see as essentially concentration camps, treated extraordinarily poorly. House Christian churches are also persecuted. These are seen in the United States as fundamental attacks on religious freedom and human rights. And I could go on with the various kind of criticisms. So let me talk more generally about or pulling together where this is. In Washington, D.C., China is a fundamental threat to the U.S. It's seen as having values that are counter to the U.S.'s. Some portray China as an existential threat to the U.S. In other words, we have a profoundly zero-sum type of relationship. That China's gains are America's losses. America's gains come at China's expense. There is no cooperation. There is no sort of middle ground. Basically, it's the U.S. wins or China wins. That's not everyone's position, but certainly many come close to it. U.S. policy is to continue to build up its military to face the China threat. U.S. pressures its allies not to use Huawei technology for 5G, as I've mentioned, not all that successfully. The U.S., more rhetorically than anything else, is encouraging U.S. firms that have investments and businesses in China to reshore those or bring them back into the U.S., and increasingly to decouple the U.S. and China economies. We're deeply interdependent, as I'll get to in a later slide, but nonetheless, the advocacy is for reducing that as much as possible. But throughout, or up through the middle of February, President Trump was not as hardline as many in the Senate and on the in the national security state, national security system, whatever we want to call it. That he was much more willing to deal with China. He wanted to win the trade war. He wanted to win in a number of respects, but he was not nearly as hardline as others were, as already mentioned. When policy was being presented to him to stop U.S. chip sales to Huawei, he said, no, we're going to continue the chip sales. And so I'll stop with there for the minute and pick up with the view from Beijing. Okay, picking up with the view from Beijing. So Beijing, I would argue that China's recent behavior over the last several years is not all that different than what came before it. Ever since Xi Jinping came to power, indeed even before that with the financial crisis, China has felt that the Western mode of operation is increasingly problematic. That China should not be bound by the way the West does things necessarily. After all, the financial crisis showed to China that they don't manage their economies very well. And so the Chinese became increasingly assertive, increasingly confident that they had a better system. And so there's been a more aggressive, if you will, or assertive is another word, angle or approach to Chinese foreign policy ever since about 2008. What's different now is that China is now much stronger than ever before it has been in the modern era. Its military is probably the second most powerful in the world, although it lacks the nuclear weapons arsenal that Russia does. But in other respects, It is an increasingly capable and increasingly wide-ranging force, not one that necessarily is capable of defeating the U.S., but one that's increasingly capable of inflicting serious damage on U.S. and its allies. And so it's been willing to use its power. China has been willing to use its power to advance its interests in a much more upfront and direct way than they had before. China has made fundamental advancements in recent years, and it feels that it deserves respect and perhaps deference, especially in Asia, that the Chinese model, its rapid long-term economic growth, its technological advancement, its ability to manage rapid modernization without losing political control, all these things are ones that deserve, in the Chinese leadership's mind, the respect and due prestige and status that should accrue to China and should make China implicitly, if not explicitly, recognized as a leader in the world, if not the leader in the Eurasian world. That they would say that China is playing a very positive role in global development through its Belt and Road Initiative, its work and contributions in the UN system, in its continuing efforts to deal with climate change, to build institutions such as the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank that meet the needs of the Global South, etc. In other words, China is playing a very helpful and positive role in the international community. Again, this speaks to both a sense that as a leader, China should have this as an obligation to do, but as receivers of these benefits that China is providing, others should defer to China's expertise. They should grant China leadership status, prestige, and so on. And in this way, China's leadership position should be further recognized and consolidated. Chinese leaders see the U.S. as increasingly unpredictable. It's constantly changing or moving the goalpost about what it wants out of China, and perhaps they're coming to the conclusion that they will simply do what they're going to do and increasingly ignore what comes out of the United States except to counter with their own propaganda and rhetorical counters to what issues out of the White House, the State Department, and elsewhere. From this U.S. unpredictability, from the effect of the virus and things to come, this seeming increase in black swan type events, first the global financial crisis of 2007-8, now the COVID outbreak, the pandemic, China must be strong to weather the existing storms and in anticipation of coming storms. It won't allow itself to be intimidated, and ultimately its bottom line is the U.S. has to accept the full implications of China's rise, which to the Chinese leadership means that China is the leader of Asia, if not of all of Eurasia. That China wants the U.S. to end its alliances in Asia. It wants Taiwan to be reincorporated or to be incorporated into the People's Republic of China with no objection from the U.S. It doesn't want human rights issues raised by the U.S., et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so that's what I think the Chinese leadership thinks about the situation now. Let's look at some of the problems with thinking about decoupling or reshoring or otherwise related to Sino-American interdependence. So here's some of the trade figures for the last several years. So USX is U.S. exports, USI, U.S. imports, China X, China exports, China I, Chinese imports, using U.S. figures and Chinese figures. I don't have the Chinese figures for last year yet. So you can see that these are in billions of dollars, that in 2018, the U.S.-China trading relationship was the largest trading relationship in the world, doing $660 billion worth of goods, but where the United States had a deficit of $419 billion. Trade went down because of the tariffs last year by $120 billion. Chinese exports basically fell quite dramatically. U.S. exports, rather surprisingly, grew a little bit, but over the past 5 years, U.S. exports haven't grown very much. China's were growing quite substantially until 2019. So this would lead many to suspect that the U.S. has a lot of leverage in the trading relationship. China needs our market more than we need the Chinese market. That said, China was the third largest export market for U.S. goods, and it ignores the fact that despite seeming gross imbalance in the trade relationship, that certain sectors of the U.S. economy needed China a great deal. To give you a sense, this is not the easiest to read from the following slide, but give you a sense here that we have U.S. chip makers' exposure to China, and about 65% of all of Qualcomm's sales come from China. For Intel, it's more than 15%, and many others are selling quite substantial amounts of goods to the PRC. If the United States refuses to allow them to sell to China, these are some of America's most high-tech, most technologically proficient firms. They will lose some of their ability to fund new research and development, to carry out other kinds of new product designs, and so on, which would hurt the long-term competitiveness of the United States. The other chart on this side of on the other side looks at Huawei's American suppliers and the amount that Huawei buys from them. Again, these are hard to see from the presentation. You can look at the slides, I hope, more carefully and come up with your own conclusions based on, this is a significant amount of what China needs coming from the U.S., but U.S. firms may need the China market as well. Here's maybe some other data of immediate relevance that may speak to the issue of decoupling as well. So in 2019, China supplied 36% of all U.S. imported antibiotics. China supplied 17% of all U.S. imported ventilators in 2019. China supplied 42% of all U.S. imported face shields in 2018, 45% of imported protective garments in 2018, 70% of all U.S. imported mouth-nose protection equipment, N95 masks, in 2018. And it supplied 39% of all imported medical gloves in 2018. So this might not be the very best time to insist that the United States stop importing from China, that we decouple our economies, as 3M produces a vast number of N95 masks in its facility outside of Shanghai. So let's move on, suggesting that even if China seems to be more vulnerable to U.S. pressures, that the United States has important interests in its trade with China, where it might be very difficult to reshore or move that production around. We may be sacrificing that production and waiting a year, 2 years, 3 years before other sources might be able to produce it. In a time of coronavirus, COVID-19, sort of cutting ourselves off from those medical supplies may not be the smart thing to do. Okay, so let's critique the U.S. position. The U.S. sees China's growing military power, and for the national security establishment, it sees China as a military threat. It deals with that by further U.S. military build-up, and in theory cooperating with like-minded allies, but the Trump administration doesn't pay a lot of attention to its allies, makes a lot of demands of them, not as much cooperation as you would have expected with other administrations willing to listen and to cooperate to a sincere degree. the United States basically seems to be moving towards a containment type of strategy. But if you're economically interdependent, it's hard to see how or what a containment strategy actually means. What exactly are you containing? That if you are providing exchange, you're providing money for China to buy technology, that's encouraging China's rapid development, its technological development, and to the degree to which that the United States is cutting China off from technology, that only increases the incentive for the Chinese to try to obtain technology they can't produce themselves by cyber espionage or other means. The U.S. criticizes many Chinese activities and initiatives, but does very little except criticize. So the United States has been complaining about Chinese individuals heading 5 UN organizations. The complaints about China aren't very persuasive if the U.S. isn't a member of some of them. In fact, the U.S. has pulled out of the Human Rights Council. It's pulled out of the United Nations Economic and Social Council, leaving in some ways room for Chinese influence. So if the U.S. isn't appointing officials to them, if it's not sort of in place to contest Chinese expansion of their sort of prestige influence, then obviously the UN is going to fall under increasing influence from the PRC. If the U.S. is going to complain about the Belt and Road Initiative and China's providing other kinds of assistance to the developing world that lead to debt traps, etc., where is the U.S. alternative to Belt and Road? If no one else is providing the financing, the United States not providing financing, what are other countries to do? Take China's money. Understand there may be strings that come with that they may not like. But who else is providing them, given many of them are already in significant or have significant levels of debt? So if the United States is going to compete, it needs to compete. In fact, if the U.S. is going to do something to challenge China in China's efforts to promote development in the global South, it needs to put up some kind of program that's effective in promoting development. Instead, the Trump administration has repeatedly tried to cut foreign aid. Washington sees China's economic rise and technological development as overwhelmingly the result of technological theft and spying. And so the prescription is to keep Chinese out of the U.S. But if cyber espionage is a concern, where is your national cybersecurity strategy regulations? Where is the sort of attempt to actually control things? Again, a lot of rhetoric, but only real action with regard to military issues. So it's playing to a repeat in some ways of Reagan-esque foreign policy dealing with the late Soviet Union. And I'll stop with this part of the presentation and move on in a minute. Okay, picking up with slide 4, part 4, the critique of the U.S., the next slide. U.S. exemplifies a degree of hubris or overweening self-confidence that in the Greek fables and classics led to the fall. But that hubris is mixed with a certain kind of insecurity as well. The U.S. or certainly U.S. policymakers see that the U.S. beat the Soviet Union, or that's what they tell themselves, rather than the Soviet Union collapsing, and that as a result, we know how to deal with these kinds of challengers. But the U.S. was not integrated the Soviet Union was not integrated into the global economy. Its power was based on its military capabilities and the ability of its political system to mobilize resources to feed its military. But it was not sort of deeply integrated into the system. It didn't have extensive trading relationships. except with its bloc partners. Its economy was not largely geared towards exports and competing internationally. It had some foreign aid for its close allies, but it really lacked the kinds of resources that enabled a sort of across-the-board challenge to the U.S. across all parts of the world. China is different in that respect, and whether the Soviet Union analogy fits is a fundamental problem. The view that China has only stolen technology, et cetera, is fallacious as well. China now has a huge number of scientists and engineers. It is investing heavily in basic science and research and development, quickly moving to be the second largest funder of those at a time when the United States is cutting scientific and technical research funds out of the national government. China's scientists are highly motivated to make fundamental advances and to become famous and wealthy, as one would expect from people who come through with breakthrough advances. It's true there's been technology theft, but it's acknowledged by almost everyone that Huawei is the world's leader in 5G basic infrastructure, backbone structures. It may not be the leader in 5G phones, which are pretty sort of standard, but it is the infrastructure behind 5G that China leads the world. And the U.S. doesn't even have a major 5G producer. The other two are Nokia of Finland and Ericsson of Sweden. So clearly the Chinese didn't steal the technology from the U.S. in this case. Many in the U.S., and particularly in the Congress, find it hard to believe that China can do better than the U.S. can, whether it's in 5G or in dealing perhaps with the COVID-19 outbreak. They either denigrate those who say China is better in some areas, or they attribute this to China's illegal behavior and cruel political system. Okay, critique of China's position. China, too, is guilty of hubris. Prior to Xi Jinping, China did an okay job of not overplaying its position or acting in ways that alienated many. They followed a slogan that is attributed to Deng Xiaoping, the reformist leader who succeeded Mao in 1978, who put in the first round of reforms, Tao Guang Hiao Hui, which meant that basically you hid your light under a bushel, or you didn't sort of take an upfront or leadership role. You made contributions, but you didn't sort of revel in them. But in recent years, Xi and many Chinese see the 21st century as the Chinese century and are trying to realize China's leading role right away. China has acted much more stridently in recent years, causing security dilemmas to emerge, actions taken by China to enhance its own security, make others feel insecure. They respond by trying to compensate, increase alliance behavior, et cetera, et cetera. This makes China feel insecure. China lashes out. China is obviously much bigger than any other country around it, except the Soviet Union in terms of land and India in terms of population. It's easy for even the best-intentioned Chinese regime to seem threatening to its smaller neighbors in Southeast Asia and in East Asia. And China's flaunting of its power is resented by many around the world. China sees the U.S. in decline because of the global financial crisis, because of Trump, because of the U.S. handling of COVID, etc., and sees this as justification for China taking a greater leadership role, and indeed seeing that China is entitled to be the leader of the world. But in many respects, that's overstepping what China can do and what people want China to do, and they are incapable of, as U.S. politicians are as well, of looking in the mirror and examining themselves self-critically. They only see well-intentioned China. American politicians only see well-intentioned U.S. And as a result, both sides are overly confident, overly sort of convinced of their own rightness, and this is a potential prescription for disaster. So where does that leave us? So we return to the Osnos essay that I asked you to read. So as I've said, the U.S. is increasingly in a Cold War mindset towards the PRC. But as I've already tried to argue, the situation isn't really analogous to the Cold War. China does have territorial demands towards Taiwan and islands in the South and East China Sea, and maybe a disputed border area with India where not all that many people live. But for the most part, China is not seeking extensive territorial expansion. It is seeking security, to be sure, as the Soviet Union was, but it is seeking that security through a diversity of means that the Soviet Union wasn't, and China's providing many more collective goods these days than the Soviet Union ever did, and increasingly, arguably, more than the U.S. is also providing these days. The stories the U.S. political elite tells itself about China and Chinese have some basis in fact, and you can go back to the Osnos essay and talk about the discussion of Chinese students in the U.S., one who is strongly attracted to the freedom and liberty, but others who are less impressed by the United States. U.S. politicians greatly underestimate the degree to which Chinese support their system and see it improving. Again, Osnos, as a master reporter, has very good sort of firsthand stories of ordinary Chinese who know about the United States, who are willing to say that they're quite confident about Chinese future. They like China. They're not necessarily all in favor of the U.S. doing whatever the U.S. is doing, and so on. They saw China improving, at least until COVID, and they take pride in it. And that's something that we don't have a strong sense, that many Chinese feel strongly, favorably about their own regime. It's not as if they're anxious to lead the overthrow of the Communist Party or take part in that process. In other words, the Communist Party has support, whether it's manufactured, whether it's sort of deeply felt, whether it is sort of a not natural support is another question. But nonetheless, the Chinese regime, the PRC, can rely on a substantial body of public support from its populace. For its part, the Chinese political elite doesn't recognize how political opinion in the U.S. has turned against China and how serious the situation is from the American point of view. They simply think that more buying or more efforts at reaching out, of trying to strike deals, will mute the tension. I think we're well beyond that. I think Osnos is saying that as well. Short phrases that characterize the relationship are not all that helpful. Are we a rivalrous relationship, competitive relationship, Cold War-like relationship, containment type of situation, etc.? Although I would say that Osnos' own characterization of uneasy coexistence isn't a bad way to characterize where we are today. Okay. So what needs to happen? Each is proud of its achievements and claims and expectations of future greatness, and they should be. Each should be proud of what it has achieved. They should have expectations of future greatness. We shouldn't necessarily assume them. We need to, walk the walk rather than simply talking the talk. But nonetheless, there's every reason to expect that if both societies continue to act in reasonable ways, that they will be leading powers in the 21st century. But each has little history of ever treating another state as a true equal. The United States talks about its special relationship with the UK or the close neighborly relations with Canada, but it's not clear that ever since 1945 the U.S. ever truly listened to UK opinion or Canada's opinion causing the U.S. to change its policies, that basically the U.S. was happy to have the U.K. follow along or Canada to follow along. But it wasn't in a true sharing type of relationship other than trade and sort of interactions of people, willingness to talk, et cetera, et cetera. The United States was always the dominant partner, was always sort of leading the agenda. The UK and Canada had little or no ability to shape an agenda. So that's the US side. During the Sino-Soviet heyday of 1950s, China was sort of anxious to gain what it could from the Soviet Union, but the fact that the Soviets were seen as the leading partner bothered Chinese leaders. They had trouble deferring, particularly after Stalin's death, to Nikita Khrushchev and other Soviet leaders, and as a result, they found it difficult to be equal partners. During the heyday of U.S.-China cooperations in the 80s, China again anxious to learn from the U.S. to take advantage of opportunities that came along with the relationship with the U.S., but they always felt that their views weren't being respected, and then after 1989, they thought that they weren't being treated appropriately. So both states have little experience and little seeming willingness to treat another country as an equal, meaning that you have to defer to some of the core interests of the other party from time to time, maybe at the expense of interests that are matter to you but are not central to you, and so on and so forth. I'd also argue that neither is comfortable thinking of itself as the number two or lower power in the world, to put it mildly. Both see themselves in their own way as the center of the world, as the greatest country on earth, et cetera, et cetera. And again, this is a claim that it's hard for countries to share. Each is convinced its own way of doing things is best for it and maybe for others, and as a result, not all that open to being told what to do by the other or to see this as unwanted interference, attempts to undermine existing political authority, and so on and so forth. And so we need ultimately for each side to look at relations in a different and perhaps a totally new way. And I'll stop there for now and pick up with the last few slides in a second. Okay, picking up with what needs to happen. Americans, and especially American politicians, have to look at China not through the glasses of American capitalist democracy or similar perspectives, such as China as human rights abuser, China as market, and so on. They need to see, or at least understand, how Chinese see China, its strengths and weaknesses, its hopes and fears. The Chinese people may not see their future as an American-style democracy. And if they do, it's one where they will have to make that future, and so on. Moreover, the U.S. needs to learn this fundamental lesson of the last 20 or more years, and that is the U.S. tried to impose its power and its systems of governance and economy on the Afghans, the Iraqis, to a lesser extent the Libyans. It may still try to do so for North Koreans and Iranians. The record of Americans of acting on American-centered or American-centric views, values, institutions in other parts of the world is not pretty. It's been a failure stretching back to Vietnam and the ones that I've mentioned, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and so on. More importantly, it wasn't successful in many, many respects. Treating China as fitting into this pattern is a ticket to disaster. It's simply not something the U.S. has the power to do. It's not something that will lead to a secure democracy in China, I would argue. That the chances that a post-communist China looks at best like Hungary today or Poland, and at worst looks like Russia or even more confrontational is just as great, if not greater, in my view. For China, China's leaders need to realize again, and they did recognize this from the mid-90s to the late 2000s, that China as a very large and increasingly powerful state is seen as threatening to many, if only because of its size. But if it acts assertively, that only generates more and more resentment. There may not be things that small countries can do or smaller countries can do about their resentment towards China, but they're looking for ways to get out of being so subservient to China, to being quite as sort of dominated by China, looking for the United States, perhaps under a different administration, to ally with them and work with them in ways that gives them greater freedom of action, et cetera, et cetera. China's leaders need to realize that at least up to the present, the U.S. has been a much greater contributor to China's rise than it has been a hindrance. That the fact that China, even with the tariffs, was able to sell as much as it did to the United States speaks to a United States that has not tried to contain China much before this time, and certainly from 1970s up through at least the start of the Trump administration, was actively contributing to China's own development, and saw this in ways that were making the United States and China more rather than less compatible. That may have been, from an American perspective, leading to greater introductions of societal differentiation, pluralism, and so on in ways that might challenge Communist Party rule. But for the most part, the United States was, and to a degree still is, a partner in China's own advance. China's leaders also need to remember that the 20 years when the U.S. and China were hostile to each other in the past, 1950 to 1970, was not a good time for China. Now, much of that had a lot to do with what Mao Zedong was doing inside China. The U.S. was hardly the only reason for that bad time in China, but Sino-American confrontation contributed to it. And other things equal, Chinese and American leaders should try to avoid further confrontations. So this leads us to a period, again, going back to Osnos, of uneasy coexistence. The consequences of armed conflict between the two sides would be disastrous for the U.S., China, and the world. The U.S. and China have some fundamentally incompatible interests. It is not simply a question of U.S.-China misunderstanding or lack of understanding. There are some areas where we have fundamental incompatible interests. Human rights as understood in both societies being one, Taiwan perhaps being another area, security in Asia being yet another. So it's not simply that we're, through more communication or more learning, we can do better, although that wouldn't hurt. There has to be a fundamental recognition that our interests clash, and then we have to figure out a way to managing those clashes of interest in ways that prevent further escalation of clashes or spillover effects into other areas. Each somehow is going to have to learn to put up with the other, that we simply have to accept the other isn't going to disappear. We're going to have to figure out, as we go along, new ways of dealing with each other, as each has its own particular strengths and weaknesses. Those will change and evolve over time, so that our strategies, our ways that we learn to deal with each other, also have to change over time. That will not be easy, and it will be a hard sell in either country's domestic politics, and perhaps for the egos of the two current leaders. And that leaves me with my final thought here, which I'm happy to discuss with you when we have our live session. Unfortunately, right now, uneasy coexistence is probably the best we can hope for. And with that, I look forward to our discussion coming up in a few days. And again, please stay healthy, stay safe, and I hope to talk to you on Tuesday. Bye.